Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa and today's video is a costume makeover. So recently I shared how I recreated Lucy's dress from the Chronicles of Narnia Prince Caspian movie. And today I'm taking that costume and sort of turning it into a, fantasy inspired, fantasy core sort of everyday dress. My original plan was to keep the outer bodice mostly the same. I kind of wanted to change the neckline and remove the gold trim, and obviously it was a laced up back, so it was still going to need something underneath it. So my plan was to take the underdress and make a blue bodice to go underneath of the main bodice, switch out the velvet sleeves for something a little less velvety. It's hard to make velvet sleeves look everyday in my opinion. And then to sew up the slit in the orange skirt and just attach that to the bodice, turning it all into one piece so that it was easier for everyday wear and just more convenient. So naturally I started with the bodice because this was the part that was most likely to go wrong, and so I didn't want to do everything else with the skirt and everything and then discover that it was all for nothing because the bodice didn't work. And the first step to this was figuring out how I had constructed it in the first place. So as usual, I did not make this with the intent of taking it apart, and the bodice is going to be especially apparent because of just how I put it together. Right, so this is fully lined, like even the sleeves are lined, even where the sleeves are attached to the bodice, all of those seams are inside. The good news is that might mean that I didn't serge the underarm seams and all, but I can't guarantee it because I don't remember. The bad news is that means that to get this all laid out flat like I want it, in order to change the neckline and everything, I need to get onto the inside and get all these side seams undone. And as I remember how I did it, this part I do remember is that the only seam that was not stitched and flipped in is the hem. And you can see what I did was I serged it, and then I attached this ribbon to it, and then for some reason that I don't remember, I put interfacing down here, and then after that I stitched the trim onto the front of the ribbon. So I need to remove this trim here so that I can remove the interfacing, so that I can remove the ribbon and the serging to hopefully get to the inside and start undoing seams. So as I said in that clip, I started out by removing the trim and the ribbon and pulling off the interfacing as best I could. And then when I went to go undo the serging at the hem, I noticed that the lining of this bodice started just kind of ripping out. And I don't know if it was because it wasn't caught as much in the serger thread or if it was dry rotting and ripping. I hope not, because I did still leave it in because it's kind of flatlined parts of the bodice. Anyway, so since it was already doing that and I had kind of a bit of a gap there and I didn't necessarily need the hem of the lining of the bodice because I was going to do a facing instead of a lining, I just took scissors and cut the opening very close to the serging to open up that bottom hem, instead of continuing to pick at the serging and potentially cause unraveling with the main bodice or just create a big mess. It was at this point that it dawned on me that I didn't necessarily have to undo the entire side seams in order to get the bodice flipped out the way I needed it for altering the neckline. And so instead of removing the entire side seams, I just went in and undid where the sleeves were inset into the bodice and the lining. I did have to undo a little of the side seams only because of the order that I had originally sewn this in. So like just the first inch of the side seams up under the armhole had to be undone in order to get the sleeves completely off. And one thing that was a game changer in this project compared to previous projects where I've taken apart outfits and made them into something new was a good seam ripper. I've never used one much before. I've always had an X-Acto knife, but I had seen a video recently about how much help a good seam ripper was, and after using this one, I have to agree. And it was at this point with the sleeves off and getting ready to turn the bodice inside out that I ran into my first problem. So I wanted to change the shape of the neckline on this because it's kind of funky shaped. It has that U down on the front that has, okay, we'll flip it back out. It has this thing. And to me, that's just odd. If it's not like for a costume and I'm wanting this to be semi everyday. So I had planned on evening it out either into a V or a square neck. And you know, even if it has to be a lot deeper, it doesn't matter in a way because it's gonna have the blue underneath it. But it just occurred to me that in order to do that, I would have to remove all of this piping, which isn't a problem. I didn't want to keep it anyway. So on a design point, that would be fine. The issue that I've run into that I forgot about is the eyelets. These are hand sewn in, and I don't see a way to, like, I don't want to pull them out. So if I change the front, then I'm going to have to remove all of this piping, which on the neckline is fine. There's no eyelets there until the end. But I don't know what to do about the back. And the only thing I can think to maybe do is just to remove all the piping up here and do all of the neckline up top, and then just cut the back, which could work because, I mean, it's not going to meet in the center back anyway. It wasn't designed to. So, you know, it could just be a larger gap in the back, I guess. So I guess I need to think about that for a minute and decide how I'm going to do this. So after contemplating it for a bit, taking a break, stepping away from it, I came back and decided that it made the most sense to just go ahead and trim up the back. So that is what I did, and then I flipped the bodice completely inside out and attempted to alter the neckline a bit. I had decided, because I don't like the shape of the neckline on the bodice as it was. To me, it was an odd choice in general. I guess it worked for the movie and for a costume, but for a only fantasy-inspired dress, it wasn't working for me. So I wanted to change it, and of course, since there was so much taken away already, I could only really kind of almost make it deeper, so I attempted to straighten it out into more of a V. After the first attempt at trying to straighten out the neckline, I removed the lining from the bodice, which at this point was only connected at the neckline, and also removed all of that piping out, which I was not going to keep. Then, since I finally had it completely flat, I went ahead and pressed out the neckline so I could see what I was doing better and properly reshaped it at this point. Now, when I did this reshaping, I did think that the neckline seemed a bit low. But at this point, I kind of couldn't think of any other way to do it. I had already cut it, so I definitely couldn't do too much to change it. And since it was going to have a bodice underneath, I wasn't overly concerned about it at that time. And next I just reshaped the neckline on the lining because even though I wasn't going to use the whole thing, I was going to use it for the facing and I needed it to match. At this point, I went ahead and restitched the lining and the bodice back together up the center back seams and around the neckline, as well as restitching the top inch or so of the side seams on the bodice where I had unpicked them while trying to get the sleeves off. After clipping and flipping the lining back to the inside of the bodice, I went ahead and trimmed the lining down so that it was more of a facing because I didn't want a fully lined bodice because I'm putting that blue bodice underneath, which is going to be the majority of the bodice really, and I just didn't want all of those layers because the original bodice is it's a organza flat line to a gray piece of fabric, and then you're gonna have the blue underneath it, and if I left that gray bodice fully lined, that would be 4 layers of fabric. Now granted, the organza is pretty thin, but I did notice that when I wore the costume, it was just a lot of layers and I didn't want that many. At this point, I went ahead and serged the edges of the facing as well as all of the side seams and the front side seams and back side seams, all those seams that previously weren't serged because they were hidden in the lining were now exposed, and so I serged them all, leaving them separated because they were originally pressed open, and I didn't serge the seams together, I just serged each seam separately because I liked the look of having them pressed open. So remember how earlier I said I didn't need those side seams undone and I restitched the top of the side seam where the sleeve had been removed because obviously it would have continued unraveling if not? Well, evidently I forgot that I actually was doing a side zipper and therefore the left seam needed to actually be undone. So I went ahead and pulled that out at this point. And then with the bodice a little more flat than it was, I pressed the facing and did some understitching as well as tacking the edges of the facing down so that they couldn't flip out. At this point, I had assembled the gray bodice as much as I could without also having the blue bodice ready. So I set about working on that. I cut the bodice out of the underdress from my original costume. And I was doing a facing on this one as well, again to minimize the number of layers. And so I cut that part out of the lining from the sleeves. Then I assembled this all the way up until the same point as the gray bodice. So shoulder seams both sewn, facing all in, and the one side seam done, with the other side seam still out. And of course the arm size were still raw because that's where the sleeves were going to go in. Now at this point, my plan was to baste these two bodices together, so up the side seams around the arm size and the waist seam, and treat it from that point on as one bodice. And this is where I ran into my second problem. So I've run into a bit of an issue here, and I kind of expected some kind of problem because, I mean, these two bodices are completely different patterns, and this original gray one from the Lucy dress had a lot of fit issues that really only worked with the Lucy dress because it was a lace bag. So I'm not surprised that things aren't matching up. But the weird thing is that this side here that's flat, I got the arm side to match up, but this side is not. So I don't know. I mean, I could theoretically not connect these yet. I could actually just finish the armhole on the gray and then just add it at the waist for a connection, but I'd really rather not. I'd rather they be together. And since it's working out flat, I think what I'm gonna do is undo these two side seams and line everything up flat and then sew them back together. I did try undoing that second seam and getting it to line up, but despite what I was thinking in the previous clip, it didn't work. I don't know why it was lining up on one side and not the other, but I did end up deciding to proceed with them as two separate bodices and hope that I could get them to line up at the waist later. Well, this video is getting a bit long, so I'm going to go ahead and stop it here. Thank you so much for watching. Part 2 will be out next week, and then you can see how it turned out.